The flashlight finds a teller's cage first. Brass bars gone green, bolted into a wall no customer has faced in 100 years. It slides sideways, across a sign half-eaten by rot that still spells Northern Hotel. Above, a faint colored glow filters through thick glass set into a modern sidewalk. People are walking on that glass right now, coffee in hand, with no idea what sits beneath their shoes. This was never a basement. It was Seattle's original street, sealed alive in the dark. Seattle is only the first of 10 American cities hiding something like this. Before you go any further underground, it helps to understand what this space was never supposed to be. A basement is something a builder plans. Someone draws a line on a blueprint, decides a floor will sit below the street, and digs down to make it happen. That is the ordinary story of an underground room. It is not what happened here. What happened here started with a pot of glue. On the afternoon of June 6, 1889, an apprentice in a Seattle cabinet shop left a pot of hot glue on a stove and walked away. It boiled over, caught fire, and within minutes the shop was burning. Seattle in 1889 was a city built almost entirely of wood, with wooden sidewalks laid over marshy, waterlogged ground and wooden buildings packed close together along narrow commercial streets. The fire moved through that arrangement the way fire moves through kindling stacked for a bonfire. It jumped from roof to roof, chewed through storefronts stocked with dry goods and liquor, and by the time it finally burned itself out the next morning, something like 25 to 31 blocks of the city's commercial core were reduced to ash and standing chimneys. Stand in that scene for a moment. Picture the smoke still hanging low over the waterfront at dawn. The smell of scorched timber and tar, business owners walking through what used to be their shops, looking for anything recognizable in the wreckage. It is the kind of disaster that could easily have ended a smaller, less determined city. It did not end Seattle. If anything, it gave the city permission to fix two problems at once. No one died in the fire. That fact alone shaped everything that came next, because it meant Seattle could treat the disaster as an opportunity instead of a tragedy to simply mourn. Within days, city leaders had drawn up new building codes. Wood was banned in the rebuilt core. Everything from now on would go up in brick and stone. That part of the story is not surprising. Cities burn, cities rebuild in sturdier materials, and the story usually ends there. But Seattle had a second, older problem that the fire didn't cause, and the fire didn't solve. The original downtown sat on tidal flats, low and swampy, and at high tide, the streets flooded with seawater and sewage. Merchants had been complaining about it for years. So when the city council sat down to plan the rebuild, they made a second decision, one with far stranger consequences than the fire code change. They decided to raise the street grade itself, in some places by a full story or more, to lift the whole downtown out of the mud for good. Here is the problem that decision created. Raising a street takes time, engineering, and money that the city did not have all at once. Merchants, meanwhile, needed to reopen and start earning money again immediately, because a business that stays closed for 2 years while a city slowly builds retaining walls is a business that quietly dies. So the merchants moved first. They rebuilt on the same low, muddy footprint their shops had always occupied, while the city worked, block by block and year by year, on raising the street around them. For a while, this created something almost absurd. A customer walking down the new elevated sidewalk would look over a low retaining wall and see a storefront a full story beneath them. Its front door and display windows opening onto what was now essentially a deep concrete trench. Ladders were the first solution. You climbed down to shop, then climbed back up to walk home, balancing packages on the rungs. Eventually, contractors built proper sidewalks that bridged the gap between the new street level and the second floor of each building. That single engineering choice quietly finished the job the fire had started. The business's original ground floors, the ones with the ornate tellers' cages and hotel lobbies, were no longer accessible from the street at all. They simply sat there, sealed behind a new sidewalk, in permanent shade, still furnished, still carrying the smell of the businesses that had once run inside them. This is easy to miss if you only picture the finished result, a dim tunnel a tour guide walks you through today. But for a stretch of years in the 1890s, this was not a museum. It was a working, half-buried city, lit by whatever light made it down through gaps in the sidewalk above, still doing business, while an entirely new Seattle was being built directly overhead. That is the detail worth sitting with. The city did not dig a hole and put a street on top of it. It built a new street over a street that was already there, already full of shops, already doing business, and simply left the old one running in the dark underneath. Glass had to solve the light problem. Thick, faceted, purple-tinted glass prisms, some of which survive in Seattle sidewalks today, were set directly into the new pavement to let a diffuse, colored daylight fall onto the buried storefronts below. If you stand on certain Pioneer Square sidewalks now, you are standing on the same glass. And the shopkeepers below you, if there were any left, would have looked up and seen your shadow pass. For a decade or so after the regrade was finished, in the 1890s and early 1900s, this half-buried world stayed in limited use, mostly as storage and back rooms, the occasional card room, a place to keep barrels and crates out of the rain. Then, a public health scare gave the city its excuse to close it entirely. Rats had moved into the abandoned lower level in enormous numbers, drawn by the dark, the shelter, and the food scraps left behind by decades of use, and when a handful of bubonic plague cases turned up in the city, officials reacted the way any city would react to that particular word. They sealed much of the underground for good, treating it less like a piece of local history and more like a hazard that needed shutting away before it spread further. It is worth pausing on how strange that is, even now. A street that had been open for business 20 years earlier was closed not because anyone valued or protected it, but because a health department decided it was safer buried than accessible. The city that had accidentally created a second hidden Seattle now actively worked to make sure nobody remembered it was there. For the next 60 years, that is more or less what it was. A hazard. A curiosity mentioned by old-timers. A rumor passed between people who had never actually been down there. The idea that an entire second Seattle sat frozen beneath the modern one did not disappear, but almost no one treated it as something worth preserving, until a newspaperman named Bill Speidel took an interest in the early 1960s. Speidel was not trying to save a tourist attraction. He was trying to save Pioneer Square itself, a neighborhood that city planners at the time genuinely wanted to bulldoze for parking and a new highway ring. He needed a way to make ordinary Seattleites care about a few blocks of aging brick buildings before the wrecking crews arrived, and he realized the sealed-off original street level beneath those buildings might be exactly that argument, made physical. If people could walk through the actual buried Seattle their grandparents had shopped in, the neighborhood above it would stop looking disposable. He was right. The first tour groups packed Pioneer Place Park, holding dollar bills, eager to see something no living Seattleite had ever been shown. The tours kept growing, public pressure kept building, and in 1970, the city named 20 square blocks of Pioneer Square a historic district, later added to the National Register of Historic Places. The underground that had once been treated as a plague risk and an embarrassment had become, almost by accident, the argument that saved the neighborhood sitting on top of it. It is worth being honest about what has happened to the story since then. Decades of tour guides have added plenty of color that the historical record does not fully support. Tales of opium dens and elaborate criminal tunnel networks running the length of downtown, sometimes with an entire secret economy built underneath the official one. Some of that almost certainly grew in the telling, the way any good story does when it is repeated nightly to paying groups for half a century. Pioneer Square in its rougher decades did have real vice, real gambling, real illegal activity, so the embellishment did not have to invent an atmosphere from nothing. It only had to stretch what was already there. That distinction matters. You do not need invented crime rings to explain why brass tellers' cages and hotel signs are sitting in the dark under a modern American street. The plain, documented facts, the fire, the regrade, the ladders, the plague scare, already do that on their own, without any help from legend. What makes this more than a strange piece of city trivia is what it reveals about how these hidden layers actually form. Nobody sat down in 1889 and decided to bury a city. A fire happened. A flooding problem needed solving. A construction timeline didn't match a business owner's need to reopen. Each decision, taken on its own, made perfect sense to the people making it. It was only the slow accumulation of those ordinary, reasonable decisions that produced something as strange as an intact street sealed a full story below a modern one, glass prisms and all, hiding in plain sight under a city that mostly forgot it was there. You can walk Pioneer Square today and see almost none of this from street level. The sidewalks look ordinary. The glass prisms, worn and clouded by more than a century of foot traffic, are easy to mistake for decorative pavement if nobody points them out. That is precisely the point. The strangeness here was never loud. It was quiet, accidental, and buried under 100 years of people simply going about their day directly above it. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If an American city can bury an entire working street by accident, simply by trying to solve a fire and a flood at the same time, what happens somewhere a city does the opposite? What happens when a city sets out on purpose to build something enormous underground, spends years and millions of dollars doing it, and then, for reasons that had nothing to do with fire or water, simply stops and walks away before it is ever used? That place exists too. It sits under a parkway in Ohio, and unlike Seattle's accidental underground, every single foot of it was engineered, funded, and dug entirely on purpose by a city that believed, for a while, that it was building its own future. A rusted iron gate sits off Central Parkway, wind pulling a plastic bag and a drift of dead leaves into a tunnel mouth that goes nowhere anyone is allowed to follow. Peer through the bars and the light gives out after 20 feet. Swallowed by a darkness that has been sitting undisturbed since before most of the people driving past this gate every morning were born. A darkness with its own temperature, its own silence, its own smell of standing water and old concrete. What is down there is not a ruin. It is a finished, engineered subway tunnel that has never once carried a passenger. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. A ruin is something that existed, worked, and then failed, the way an old mill or a shuttered factory tells its story through rust and collapse. This is something else entirely, a space frozen not in decline, but in anticipation. Cincinnati built its subway completely on purpose, spent years and millions of dollars doing it, and then simply stopped before a single train ever ran, leaving concrete platforms standing ready for a crowd that would never arrive. The idea did not start with ambition. It started with a smell. For most of the 19th century, the Miami and Erie Canal cut through the middle of Cincinnati, carrying goods and passengers north toward the Great Lakes. Boats loaded with grain and lumber moving slowly past warehouses and mills. By the 1880s, railroads had taken over that job almost entirely. Faster, cheaper, and not dependent on ice-free water. The canal did not disappear when it became obsolete. It simply sat there, stagnant, collecting trash, sewage, and mosquitoes, an open wound running straight through the middle of a growing city. Residents complained about the smell for years before anyone did anything about it. A local newspaper suggested, as early as 1884, that the dead canal bed would make a perfect route for something new, a subway, with a wide boulevard built directly on top of it, covering the stagnant water and solving two problems with one piece of engineering. That is not a small detail. Cincinnati was not carving a subway out of solid rock beneath its streets, the way a city might if it were starting from nothing. It was reusing a corridor the city already owned, a corridor that had already failed once at its original purpose. The subway was in a sense a second attempt at making that same strip of land useful, and for a while, it looked like it might actually work. Voters approved a bond issue for a 16-mile transit loop in 1916, and ground was broken in January 1920, 4 years later than planned, delayed in part by the country's entry into the First World War. For a few years after that, the project moved the way ambitious infrastructure is supposed to move. Crews dug through the old canal bed, poured concrete, and built stations. Race Street, Liberty Street, Brighton Place, each one meant to serve a growing, prosperous city that was, at the time, ranked among the largest in the country. By 1923, roughly 2 miles of tunnel were finished. Platforms were in place, wide and tiled, built to a scale meant for real crowds. Track beds were graded and ready. Wooden stringers, the timber supports meant to hold rails in position. were bolted directly into the tunnel floor, waiting for the final layer of steel that was supposed to come next. That is where the story should turn into a familiar one. A city with a brand new subway, commuters filing down into clean, tiled stations every morning on their way downtown. It did not happen. Here is the problem. Inflation from the First World War had already pushed construction costs well past the original 1916 budget by the time crews reached the tunneling stage, a common story for infrastructure projects planned in one economic era and built in another. Every dollar the bond money bought in 1916 bought noticeably less by 1922, and completing the full 16-mile loop, engineers now estimated, would require millions more than voters had originally approved. At the same time, city politics shifted hard. A reform movement led by Murray Seasongood took control of City Hall in the mid-1920s, and Seasongood's Charter Party viewed the transit project as a legacy of the old political machine it had just replaced, not as something to champion or finish. Newspapers sympathetic to the new administration began printing arguments against the subway that had barely been raised before, questioning tight curves in the tunnels and claiming they were too narrow for practical use. Momentum that should have carried the project to completion instead ran straight into new leadership that had little political reason to finish someone else's plan and take credit for someone else's vision. No single cause fully explains what happened next, and that is worth being honest about, because a documentary story is often tempted to pick one clean villain when the real record rarely cooperates. Some historians point to the cost overruns as the decisive factor. Others point to the political turnover, arguing that with different leadership, the money problems could have been solved the way large infrastructure problems usually are, through renegotiation and phased construction. Still others note that the rising popularity of the automobile was already quietly working against any American city's appetite for rail investment by the late 1920s, making voters and politicians alike less willing to fight for a project many now saw as outdated before it even opened. The honest answer is that all three problems arrived at roughly the same time, stacked on top of each other, and together they were enough to stop something that had already been half built. By 1928 and 1929, the transit project was formally abandoned. Central Parkway opened to traffic in 1928, built directly on top of the unfinished tunnels below it, the boulevard the 1884 newspaper had imagined finally real. The subway underneath it was not. The Great Depression arrived almost immediately afterward and made sure nobody was going to reconsider. What was left behind, sealed under one of Cincinnati's busiest streets, was 2 miles of subway that had cost the city millions of dollars and had never once opened its doors to the public. You can still see where the tunnel begins if you know where to look, a gated opening cut into a retaining wall along Central Parkway, easy to mistake for a maintenance access point unless someone tells you what it actually is. Inside, engineers who have inspected the space over the decades, sometimes decades apart, have consistently found it in remarkably solid condition, dry, largely free of the kind of structural decay that usually comes with a century of neglect. The concrete has held. The platforms are intact, tiles still clinging to some of the walls. The wooden rail ties are still bolted into the floor, waiting for tracks that were never laid on top of them, exactly where workers left them roughly 100 years ago. That single detail is worth sitting with. This is not a subway that crumbled from neglect the way an abandoned building slowly gives way to weather and time. It is a subway that was built well enough and solidly enough to last for a century in the dark, and simply never used for the one purpose it was built to serve. Stand at that gate on Central Parkway for a moment and try to picture it the way its builders pictured it in 1920. Platforms crowded with commuters heading downtown. Streetcars replaced by something faster and cleaner running underground. A growing city solving its own congestion problem with concrete and steel. That image never happened, not for a single day. What happened instead is an empty tunnel, structurally sound enough, according to engineers who have surveyed it, to remain usable for another century or more. Still waiting for a train that will almost certainly never come. Cincinnati has spent the better part of a century trying to figure out what to do with the space it built, and then walked away from. And the list of failed second acts is almost as strange as the tunnel itself. In the 1930s, city officials floated running electric trolleys through the tunnel instead of the subway cars originally planned, only to discover the curves were too tight for existing streetcars to navigate safely at any useful speed. During the Cold War, someone suggested converting sections into a fallout shelter, stocked with supplies for civilians in the event of nuclear attack. A plan that went nowhere but reflects how seriously the space was still being considered decades after construction stopped. Over the years, people have proposed a wine cellar taking advantage of the tunnel's constant cool temperature, a commercial mushroom farm exploiting the same conditions, additional highway capacity squeezed into the existing right-of-way, and even a nightclub or event space built into one of the abandoned stations. A film crew once used a section of tunnel as a location for a Batman movie. None of these ideas ever moved past the proposal stage. In 2002, voters were offered the closest thing to a real second chance the tunnels have ever had, a regional light rail measure called Metro Moves that would have funded a modern transit system using at least part of the existing tunnel infrastructure. Voters rejected it by a wide margin, and the tunnels went back to sitting exactly as they had for most of the previous 80 years. What makes this stranger than an ordinary abandoned construction project is the scale of what survived intact. This is not a single forgotten room or a boarded-up station entrance tucked behind a fence. By most accounts, it is the largest built but unused subway tunnel system in the United States, a fully engineered piece of a functioning transit system, complete with multiple stations, that has simply never been switched on in the better part of a century. There is something particular about a place built for crowds that were never allowed to arrive. Cincinnati's subway was not destroyed by war, fire, or disaster, the way so many ruins are. It was defeated by ordinary things, inflation, a change in City Hall, a ballot measure that failed by a comfortable margin decades later. That is arguably the more unsettling version of this story. Nothing dramatic happened here. No single catastrophic event anyone could point to afterward and say, that is what killed it. A whole underground world, complete with stations and platforms and rail ties bolted into concrete, was simply left unfinished, one budget shortfall and one election at a time. Until everyone involved had moved on, and the tunnels were left to sit quietly in the dark, structurally perfect, and functionally useless for the better part of a century. But Cincinnati's abandoned ambition is not the strangest version of an underground space left unused in America. At least here, nobody ever got to see what the finished subway would have looked like in operation, crowded and lit and running the way its builders intended. 900 miles east, in Manhattan, an entirely different underground space was not only finished, it opened, it dazzled, it made headlines around the world on its very first day, with chandeliers and vaulted tile ceilings built to impress an entire city. And then, within 4 decades, it was closed anyway, for a reason that had nothing to do with money, politics, or war, and everything to do with the shape of the room itself. A Downtown 6 train pulls away from its final scheduled stop and keeps moving, curving through a loop most riders barely notice. Because most riders are looking at their phones instead of out the window. For a few seconds, if the lights happen to be on, the window fills with color. Green tile arches, a leaded glass skylight, the dull gleam of a brass chandelier no one has dusted in decades. Then the curve straightens out, and it is gone, and the train is heading back uptown as if nothing happened. What just passed by is one of the most beautiful rooms ever built for a subway system anywhere in the world, and almost nobody riding through it knows its name. It is called City Hall Station, and it opened on October 27, 1904 as the ceremonial crown jewel of New York City's very first subway line. Start with what that opening day actually looked like, because it is easy to underestimate how much this station mattered at the time. New York in 1904 had no underground rail system at all. Getting across town meant elevated trains rattling overhead, streetcars competing for road space, and horse-drawn traffic-clogging streets that were never designed for a city this size. Earlier attempts at solving this problem had already come and gone. In 1870, an inventor named Alfred Beach had secretly built a short pneumatic tube line beneath Broadway, powered by pressurized air rather than steam, only to see the project collapse under political opposition after just a few years of quiet operation. The idea of an underground New York did not die with Beech's tube. It simply waited 3 decades for the right combination of money, engineering, and political will. The Interborough Rapid Transit Company had spent 4 years digging the city's first true subway line, and City Hall Station was chosen as its southern terminus, the place where the whole project would make its first public impression. The company hired architects George Hines and Christopher Lafarge, the same team behind the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and brought in Raphael Guastavino, a master of self-supporting tile vaulting whose technique used interlocking terracotta tiles instead of steel to hold a ceiling's own weight, to build something unlike anything else in the system. The result was a station with arched tiled vaults overhead, leaded glass skylights letting in filtered daylight, and chandeliers hanging over a platform laid out in an elegant sweeping curve unlike the straight platforms built everywhere else on the line. That curve is worth paying attention to, because it is both the reason this station became beautiful and, eventually, the reason it stopped being used. On opening day, the mayor himself took the controls of the very first train, and the celebration that followed had the feel of a citywide holiday. Couples dressed up and rode the new subway simply for the experience of it, some staying on board for hours, riding back and forth between City Hall and 145th Street just to say they had done it. The whole system, all 28 stations of it, was a genuine spectacle. But City Hall was the one built to impress, the one meant to prove that New York's underground could rival anything London or Paris had already built. Here is the old assumption worth stating plainly, because the story only makes sense once you see how it gets broken. A flagship station, purpose-built to be the most impressive stop on a brand new subway line, should stay important. It should be the busy one, the one everyone passes through, the one that only grows more central as the system around it expands. That is not what happened to City Hall Station. Instead, it slowly became one of the least useful stops in the entire network, and the reason has nothing to do with neglect or bad luck. It has to do with the very feature that made it so striking in the first place. The station's platform was built on a tight curve, elegant to look at, but a genuine problem for anything except the short, specifically designed cars the ERT ran when the line first opened. As the subway system grew over the following decades, trains got longer, and their doors were positioned for straight platforms, not curved ones. An industry-wide shift towards standardized rolling stock that City Hall's one-of-a-kind geometry simply could not keep pace with. City Hall's platform could not safely accommodate the newer, longer cars without special door controls, limiting which doors could even open, since a door aligned for a straight platform might open onto empty space, or a wall on a curve this tight. Meanwhile, the very next stop north, Brooklyn Bridge Station, sat closer to connecting streetcars, handled express trains, and simply moved more people, more efficiently, with none of City Hall's structural quirks. Ridership at the ornate terminus dwindled for years, station agents reportedly working shifts with barely a handful of passengers passing through in a given hour. The station never even got turnstiles installed, unlike almost every other stop in the system, because by the time turnstiles became standard around 1923, so few people were using City Hall that it barely seemed worth the expense of installing them. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of this chapter. City Hall Station did not fail because it was ugly, forgotten, or badly built. It failed, in practical terms, because its own design, the very curve that made it a showpiece, made it physically incompatible with the subway system's own growth. By the mid-1940s, the city had a decision to make. Longer platforms were needed everywhere to keep pace with the newer subway cars, and City Hall's tight, curved layout could not be reasonably extended or widened without essentially rebuilding it from scratch, for a station that already carried a fraction of the traffic of its neighbor one stop away. On December 31st, 1945, the city closed City Hall Station to the public for good. Here is what makes this chapter different from an ordinary story of urban decline. The station did not go dark. It did not get sealed behind a wall the way Cincinnati's subway tunnels were. Because the tight curve that closed it to passengers was also useful for something else entirely, turning trains around, City Hall Station kept a second life as the loop track where the downtown 6 train reverses direction before heading back uptown. Every single day since 1945, trains have continued to glide silently through this abandoned, ornate space, lit by its original skylights and chandeliers, without a single passenger ever getting off. That is the detail worth sitting with before moving on. Somewhere below Lower Manhattan sits one of the most architecturally ambitious rooms the New York subway ever built, still in daily operational use as a piece of track, and functionally invisible to almost everyone who passes through it. You can, if you know the trick, glimpse it for yourself. Ride the downtown 6 train past its final scheduled stop and stay on board through the loop, technically against the rules but tolerated by most conductors, and for a handful of seconds, tile, gold light, ironwork, and then the ordinary tunnel returns and the train straightens out heading north again. Generations of curious New Yorkers have done exactly this, craning toward the window at the right moment, and generations of conductors have quietly allowed it, understanding, apparently, that staying on past your stop for this specific reason has become something like an unofficial local tradition, passed down the way certain city secrets always are, mostly by word of mouth. The formal way to see the station properly is far more restricted and far more thorough. The New York Transit Museum runs limited tours, open only to museum members, tickets released a handful of times a year and generally selling out within the hour. Those tours typically begin not underground at all, but above it in City Hall Park. With a history of the neighborhood and of Alfred Beach's forgotten pneumatic tube before participants ever descend a single stair. Those who make it inside afterward get to walk the platform itself, look up at the vaulted Guastavino ceiling and the leaded glass skylight above the old ticket mezzanine, and stand where, on a single afternoon in 1904, an entire city celebrated the arrival of a new kind of transportation. The oak ticket booth that once collected fares here no longer survives, but the surrounding tilework, the ironwork, and the curve of the platform remain essentially unchanged since the day it opened, down to the specific pattern of the tile arches ringing the mezzanine ceiling. Recognition eventually caught up with what had been lost, though only after decades of near total public forgetting. City Hall Station received interior landmark status in 1979, and it was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2004, exactly 100 years after it first opened its doors to a celebrating city. Both honors arrived only after decades in which most New Yorkers had functionally forgotten the station existed at all, let alone that it still sat fully intact directly beneath their feet. What this chapter adds to the larger investigation is a different kind of underground mystery than Seattle's accident or Cincinnati's abandoned ambition. This is not a space that was buried by fire or flood, and it is not a space that failed before it ever opened. It is a space that succeeded completely, on its own terms, on its very first day. Drawing crowds and headlines and a mayor at the controls of the inaugural train, and it was closed anyway because success and scalability turned out to be two entirely different things. A curve built for beauty could not accommodate a subway system built for growth, and beauty lost, not gradually through neglect, but through a specific, identifiable engineering conflict between one station's original design and everything the system became after it. There is something quietly unsettling about a room this carefully made, sitting almost entirely unseen for nearly 80 years. It did not decay the way Cincinnati's tunnels might have, sealed and forgotten in damp concrete. It did not collapse or flood. It simply stopped mattering to the system it was built to serve, while continuing every single day, without fail, to do one small invisible job for that same system in the dark, turning trains around in the exact spot where a city once celebrated the future arriving underground for the first time. Consider what that means for how we think about failure. Nothing about City Hall Station was a mistake in the way Cincinnati's abandoned subway or a burned-out storefront might be called a mistake. Every decision that led to its closure was, in isolation, reasonable. Longer trains needed straighter platforms. A busier neighboring station could handle the traffic more efficiently. Rebuilding a landmark this ornate just to keep pace with a growing system made little financial sense when an adequate alternative already existed one stop away. And yet the sum of those reasonable decisions was the quiet retirement of the most beautiful room the subway ever built. One abandoned, beautiful station raises an obvious question. What happens when an entire underground world is not a single closed room, but a functioning, thriving second economy deliberately carved out of solid rock and kept running for the benefit of businesses that never see daylight at all. That world exists too, cut directly into a limestone hillside in the American Midwest, and it is bigger, by a wide margin, than anything City Hall Station or Cincinnati's abandoned tunnels ever attempted to be. A truck driver eases through a tunnel mouth cut into a limestone bluff on the edge of Kansas City, and does not stop driving for what feels like actual city blocks. Painted street signs pass by on the right. Loading docks recede into the dark on the left. Fluorescent lights hang from a stone ceiling far overhead, and the air stays cool and dry no matter what the temperature is doing outside. This is not a mine anymore, even though it used to be one. It is a business complex, built entirely underground, with its own road grid, its own rail line, and its own postal address, and by most measures it is the largest space of its kind on Earth. It is called Subtropolis, and the story of how an exhausted limestone quarry became one of the more unusual commercial success stories in the American Midwest starts with a very old assumption about what an empty mine is actually for. Here is that assumption stated plainly. Once a mine has given up everything valuable inside it, once the ore or the stone has been hauled out and sold, the space it leaves behind is dead weight, a hole in a hillside with nothing left to offer, worth sealing off, worth forgetting, worth treating as a hazard rather than an asset. That assumption falls apart the moment you understand how this particular limestone was mined in the first place. Beneath the bluffs north of the Missouri River sits a layer of rock known as Bethany Falls limestone. Laid down roughly 270 million years ago beneath an ancient shallow sea, long before anything resembling a Kansas prairie existed at the surface above it. Through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, companies extracted that stone using a technique called room and pillar mining, cutting wide. Rectangular tunnels through the rock while leaving thick square columns of stone standing at regular intervals to hold the ceiling up. A method chosen because it let miners remove a large share of the deposit while keeping the whole structure from caving in on the workers below. The technique was chosen for efficiency and worker safety, not for what would come afterward. But the byproduct of that efficiency was something nobody had fully planned for: an enormous, already finished underground structure, complete with a grid of streets and load-bearing pillars, sitting empty the moment the last useful stone had been hauled out. By the middle of the 20th century, mining activity in the area had slowed considerably as demand shifted and easier deposits elsewhere became more economical to work. And a businessman named Lamar Hunt, better known today as the founder of the Kansas City Chiefs and a key figure in the early history of American professional football and soccer, saw an opportunity in what everyone else saw as a dead space. Hunt was already known for backing ventures other people considered unlikely to work, and an abandoned mine full of square-cut tunnels fit that pattern. Starting in 1964, his company, Hunt Midwest, began leasing out sections of the emptied mine, not for storage as an afterthought, but as the beginning of a deliberate, long-term commercial strategy built around a simple pitch, stable temperature, structural strength, and a road network that had, in effect, already been built for free by decades of prior mining work. Here is the contradiction that makes this chapter worth telling. An old, exhausted mine should have no future beyond collapse or abandonment. Instead, this particular mine turned out to be more valuable completely empty than it had ever been full of stone. 3 things made it so. First, the constant temperature, sitting reliably between 65 and 70 degrees year-round, regardless of the Missouri weather overhead, meant heating and cooling costs for tenants dropped dramatically compared to a surface building, an advantage that only grows more attractive as energy prices rise. Second, the solid limestone roof, supported by those same mining pillars, turned out to be extraordinarily strong enough that operators today describe portions of the complex as able to withstand direct impacts that would level an ordinary building, making it attractive for anyone storing something they cannot afford to lose to a tornado, a fire, or worse. Third, and perhaps most valuable of all, the room and pillar method had already handed developers a ready-made street grid, 16-foot high, 40-foot wide corridors running on a regular pattern, without anyone having to engineer a single new tunnel from scratch. saving what would otherwise have been an enormous excavation cost before a single tenant ever moved in. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The mining company that dug these tunnels in the early 20th century was not thinking about business parks. It was thinking about extracting stone as cheaply as possible. And yet the specific shape that cheap extraction left behind happened to be almost perfectly suited to a second life nobody involved could have predicted. Today, Subtropolis stretches across more than 900 acres, up to 160 feet beneath the surface, laced with more than 6 miles of paved lit roadway and several miles of railroad track, all of it inside solid rock. Streets are named for the geological layers of limestone and shale they run through, rather than for any developer's marketing department. A small detail that gives the whole place the feel of a city that grew up according to its own internal logic rather than anyone's master plan. What sits inside that grid is where the story gets stranger. The United States Postal Service leases roughly 500,000 square feet here, using it to warehouse copies of every postage stamp the agency has ever issued. Protected by rock instead of a vault, along with other archival materials the agency considers too important to risk on the surface. The National Archives keeps federal court records and tax documents in climate-controlled rooms carved directly into the limestone, choosing the mine specifically because paper degrades slower in stable temperature and low humidity than it does almost anywhere above ground. A film preservation company stores hundreds of thousands of original movie reels here, including prints of titles as historically significant as Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz, specifically because the mine's steady temperature and humidity slow the chemical decay that destroys old film stock faster in an ordinary surface warehouse, and because storing prints in geographically separate locations protects the industry against losing everything to a single regional disaster. Ford has used sections of the complex to store and finish vehicles, at times housing thousands of unsold cars and trucks at once, waiting out slow sales periods in climate-controlled darkness rather than an outdoor lot exposed to weather. An automotive shop applies bedliners and custom graphics to brand new pickup trucks on an assembly line lit entirely by artificial light. 150 feet underground, workers arriving each morning to a job that never once requires stepping outside. Here is the implication worth pausing on. Some of America's most historically and legally significant physical records, the master copies of classic films, federal court archives, the nation's own postage stamp history, are not sitting in some architecturally impressive vault built for the purpose. They are sitting inside a hollowed-out hill that a mining company dug for entirely unrelated commercial reasons nearly a century ago. None of this required a controversial theory or a contested reinterpretation of evidence to establish. Unlike some of the underground stories in this investigation, Subtropolis is not disputed, not shrouded in myth, not argued over by historians with competing interpretations of what the evidence actually shows. It is simply true, documented in trade publications and company records alike, and still expanding, with additional millions of square feet of new commercial space under active development inside the mine as recently as the past few years. What deserves a moment of caution, though, is how little most outsiders understand about how common this pattern actually is around Kansas City specifically. Subtropolis is the largest example, but it is far from the only one. The region as a whole holds an unusually large share of America's underground industrial real estate, tens of millions of square feet across multiple converted mines. Largely because the same geological formation runs beneath much of the metro area, and multiple companies quarried it using the same room and pillar method over the same several decades. Dozens of smaller underground business parks operate around Kansas City today, most of them invisible to anyone who does not work inside one, housing everything from record storage to light manufacturing. Kansas City did not plan to become a hub of underground commercial real estate. It backed into the role, one abandoned limestone mine at a time, the same way Seattle backed into its buried street and Cincinnati backed into its unused tunnels, through ordinary decisions that only look extraordinary once you add them all together across an entire region and an entire century. There is a version of this story that treats Subtropolis as a curiosity, a strange piece of trivia about vans getting painted underground and old film reels sitting in a cave. But the more useful way to think about it is as a case study in how thoroughly a landscape can be reshaped by decisions nobody made with the future in mind. The room and pillar miners who cut these tunnels in the early 20th century were solving a purely immediate problem: how to remove stone efficiently and safely without the ceiling collapsing on them. They were not thinking about postage stamps, film preservation, or pickup truck upfitting. And yet the specific geometry their safety requirements produced, wide corridors, regular pillars, a predictable grid, turned out to be exactly what a very different set of tenants would need half a century later. You could drive through Subtropolis for what feels like several minutes and never once glimpse daylight, headlights sweeping across the same limestone pillars over and over, and after a while, you might start to lose track of whether you are inside a business park or a cave, because in the most literal sense possible, you are inside both at exactly the same time. That confusion is, in a strange way, the entire point of this chapter. A hole dug purely to remove rock turned out to be worth more empty than the rock inside it ever was, and it raises an uncomfortable question about what else American cities might be quietly hiding underground, not by accident and not out of fear, but simply because it made good financial sense to do so. Subtropolis proves that an underground story can be entirely true, thoroughly documented, and still feel almost unbelievable on its own merits, without a single invented detail needed to make it strange. But not every legendary underground network in America holds up nearly as well once historians actually go looking for the evidence behind it. Out on the Pacific coast, in a city famous for its rain and its coffee, tour guides have spent half a century telling visitors about a network of tunnels supposedly used to kidnap sailors and drag them, drugged and unconscious, straight down to the waterfront to be sold onto ships bound for distant ports. The tunnels themselves are real, brick-lined and still standing beneath the old part of the city. What actually happened inside them is a considerably more complicated question, and the answer depends on which kind of evidence you are willing to trust. A tour group ducks through a low brick archway beneath a pizza parlor in Portland's Old Town, the guide's voice dropping to something theatrical as the ceiling forces everyone to stoop and the smell of old brick and standing damp settles over. The group. Down here, the story goes, drug sailors were once dragged unconscious through a maze of connected passages, straight from a waterfront saloon to a waiting ship bound for Asia, never seeing daylight again until they woke up at sea, already crewing a voyage they never agreed to. It is a genuinely chilling story. The tunnels themselves are real. Whether they were ever actually used the way this tour claims is a much harder question, and it is worth taking seriously, because the honest answer sits somewhere between the two extremes people usually reach for. Start with what is not in dispute. Shanghaiing, the practice of forcing men into unwilling service on a ship, usually through deception, drugging, or outright violence, was a real and well-documented feature of 19th century port cities, and Portland was very much one of them. Sailing ships needed large crews, the work was brutal and poorly paid, and few men volunteered for it willingly once word got around about the conditions, the long voyages, the harsh discipline, and the very real chance of dying at sea, far from home. Into that gap stepped men called crimps, essentially labor traffickers who supplied ship captains with bodies in exchange for a fee, regardless of whether those bodies had agreed to go anywhere at all. One of Portland's most notorious crimps, a man named Joseph Kelly, known locally as Bunko Kelly, became infamous enough that his methods were still being discussed and exaggerated decades after his death. Credited in local legend with everything from drugging drinks to selling corpses to unsuspecting captains, a claim itself impossible to fully verify. Sailors' boarding houses along the waterfront doubled as recruiting grounds, offering cheap beds and cheaper whiskey to men who had no idea the same building supplied crews to departing ships, and drug drinks, most likely dosed with something like chloral hydrate, were a documented tool of the trade, quiet, efficient, and far less risky for the crimp than physical force. None of that is myth. It is recorded in newspapers, court documents, and the accounts of sailors themselves. The debated part is much more specific, and it matters because the specific version people are actually shown on a modern tour is the tunnel network itself. Real basements do connect beneath Old Town Portland, brick-lined, low-ceilinged, occasionally linked by short passageways between buildings. Some still bearing the marks of old delivery hatches and iron rings once used to secure crates. Historically, they served an entirely mundane purpose. Goods arriving off ships docked on the Willamette River needed to move to storage cellars without clogging the streets above with cart traffic, and basement-level passages solved that problem the same way service corridors solve it in any working port city. That much is documented and uncontroversial. Here is where the tempting interpretation takes over, the point where a careful reader has to slow down. If basements connect the waterfront to the heart of Old Town, and Shanghaiing definitely happened in this neighborhood, it is an easy leap to assume the tunnels were built, or at least used, specifically to drag captured men underground and out of sight straight to the docks, without any witness ever seeing them dragged through the street. It is a vivid image, and it is the exact image most Shanghai tunnel tours are built around today. The trouble is that historians who have gone looking for evidence to support that specific claim have consistently come up short. Barney Blalock, a Portland historian who has spent years researching the city's waterfront crimping trade in exhaustive detail, found no primary source. No period newspaper account, no court record, no first-hand testimony from the era itself, describing an organized tunnel route used to move captured sailors underground to the docks. The Oregon Historical Society has published similar conclusions after reviewing the same material. What both found instead is that the specific tunnels to the docks narrative appears to trace back to a 1962 newspaper feature and, more directly, to a walking tour business founded in 1979 by a local figure named Michael Jones, whose Cascade Geographic Society built an entire attraction around collected oral histories, some secondhand, some embellished. Gathered from people who had heard stories from other people, decades after the supposed events took place, the kind of testimony that grows more dramatic and more specific with every retelling, even when everyone involved believes they are simply passing along the truth. It helps to walk through this debate in the order it actually unfolds for anyone who looks into it seriously. First comes the physical detail nobody disputes, that basements do connect beneath Old Town, some linked by short passageways. Then comes the tempting interpretation that these connected spaces must be the Shanghaiing route everyone has heard about. Then comes the reason that interpretation caught on so completely, vivid 1970s tours, ghost stories layered on top, and a charismatic local promoter willing to fill in gaps in the record with confident, colorful detail. Only after that do the historians' objections arrive, the missing primary sources, the absence of period newspaper accounts describing tunnel-based abductions, and the physical problems with the waterfront itself. And what remains, once all of that has been weighed, is a genuine, unresolved uncertainty, not a settled myth and not a settled fact. There is also a purely physical problem with the most dramatic version of the story, the kind of detail that rarely makes it into a 90-minute tour but matters enormously to a historian. Portland's harbor did not even have a proper harbor wall until 1929, well after the supposed golden age of tunnel-based Shanghaiing in the 1890s, meaning any tunnel reaching toward open water during the peak years of the practice would have been reaching toward an unstable, unprotected bank rather than a fixed, engineered edge. And the waterfront flooded seasonally, for roughly half the year by some estimates, which raises an obvious practical question about how reliably any underground passage could have functioned as a route to the docks without regularly filling with water at exactly the times of year crimps would have needed it most. A tunnel that floods for months at a time is not a reliable transportation network. It is, at best, an occasional shortcut, unusable for a significant portion of the very period it supposedly served. That does not mean nothing happened down here. The genuinely careful, evidence-based version of this story is more modest than the tour version, but still unsettling in its own right, and arguably more interesting precisely because it resists easy drama. Some basement rooms beneath Old Town likely were used to hold or drug victims for a short period, functioning less like a transportation corridor and more like a holding cell, a place to keep someone unconscious or disoriented until they could be moved through ordinary streets, at night, under cover of darkness, rather than concrete. The way most Shanghaiing elsewhere in the world was actually carried out. That is a real, documented possibility, distinct from, and considerably less cinematic than, an entire underground highway built specifically for kidnapping. It is worth walking through why the more dramatic version caught on so thoroughly, because that is its own kind of evidence about how history gets shaped after the fact, sometimes by people with no intention to deceive anyone. Portland's waterfront in the late 19th century really was rough, genuinely full of crime, vice, and exploitation. So audiences hearing tunnel stories were not being asked to imagine an atmosphere from nothing. The neighborhood already had a reputation, documented in newspapers of the time describing drunkenness, robbery, and disappearance around the docks. A tour guide claiming kidnapped sailors were dragged through connected basements was building on a foundation of real danger and real crime. Simply extending it into a specific claim the underlying reputation made easy to believe without much resistance. Ghost stories layered on top over the following decades, tales of hauntings and restless spirits supposedly tied to the tunnels, only deepened the sense that something dark and organized must have happened down here. Even as the specific evidence for that organization continued to be missing from the actual historical record, and yet the caution from serious historians remains. No primary sources, no period accounts describing an organized route. A physical layout, given the flooding and the missing harbor wall, that makes the most extreme version of the claim difficult to reconcile with conditions on the ground. What can be said with more confidence is that Shanghaiing was real, that basements beneath Old Town are real, and that some of those spaces plausibly served as short-term holding areas for victims. What cannot be said with confidence, based on the surviving historical record, is that a purpose-built or even consistently used tunnel network moved captured men underground all the way to the waterfront. None of that makes the tunnels themselves any less worth visiting or any less genuinely old. Walking beneath Old Town today. Ducking under the same low brick arches generations of tour guides have ducked under before you, it is easy to feel the weight of a neighborhood's rough history pressing in from every side, damp brick close on both shoulders, the guide's flashlight catching old graffiti and water stains on the walls. What is harder to feel, standing in the dim light of a basement room, is exactly where the documented history ends and the performance begins, and that uncertainty is, arguably, the most honest takeaway a visitor can leave with. You are not being lied to exactly, you are being told a story that grew, decade by decade, out of a real and ugly history, until the story became more vivid than the evidence underneath it could actually support. This is, in its own way, a different kind of underground mystery than anything covered so far in this investigation. Seattle's underground is a story about accidental preservation. Cincinnati's is a story about abandoned ambition. Kansas City's is a story about a real, if unlikely, second economy built into stone. Portland's underground is a story about how a real historical horror can attract an exaggerated physical explanation, and how difficult it can be, once a version of events has been repeated to paying tour groups for half a century, to pull the embellishment back apart from the evidence underneath it. Portland's underground turned out to be smaller and considerably murkier than its own legend claims, a lesson in how carefully a good story needs to be checked against the paper trail before it gets repeated as fact. But not every underground story in America involves debating what happened decades or centuries ago. Some of the strangest hidden layers beneath modern American cities are not historical puzzles waiting to be resolved by a careful researcher poring over old newspapers. They are happening in the present tense, tonight, in the shadow of some of the brightest, most heavily surveilled lights in the entire country, and they involve people who are still very much alive, still making choices. In the dark, right now, while this very story is being told. A caseworker's flashlight crosses a plywood platform, raised off a concrete floor, a folded tarp, a stack of belongings arranged with obvious care despite the surroundings. Somewhere above, close enough that the sound carries down through a storm grate, a casino's air conditioning units hum against the desert heat, an ordinary mechanical sound that down here feels almost out of place. This is a drainage tunnel, built to move floodwater safely away from the Las Vegas Strip. Tonight, like most nights, someone is living in it, a few hundred feet from a stage full of neon lights that never turns off. That is the physical fact worth sitting with before anything else in this chapter. Beneath one of the most photographed, most surveilled, most brightly lit strips of pavement in the entire country runs a second, much darker world, and it has almost nothing to do with history in the way every other chapter in this investigation has. It is happening right now, this week, in a city built almost entirely around the idea that everything worth seeing happens in the light. Start with the infrastructure itself, because understanding why this space exists at all matters before getting to who lives inside it. The Las Vegas Valley sits in a desert, dry for most of the year, but capable of sudden, violent monsoon rains during the summer months that can dump an enormous volume of water in a short period, more than the desert ground. Hardened by decades of pavement and development, can absorb on its own. Flash floods in a city built largely on pavement are a genuine engineering problem, one regional planners had to solve as the valley grew from a small desert town into a major metropolitan area over just a few decades, starting in the late 1970s and continuing through the 1990s. Regional authorities built an extensive network of concrete flood channels and storm drains beneath the valley to carry that water safely away from streets, homes, and casinos, a project that has continued to expand and be upgraded in the decades since. Today, that system stretches across roughly 600 miles, according to estimates from the Clark County Regional Flood Control District. Much of it running directly underground, some sections wide enough to walk through upright, others barely tall enough to crouch inside. Here is the old assumption worth naming, because this chapter only makes sense once you see it broken. Storm drains are infrastructure, full stop. Empty concrete channels built to move water, nothing more, with no reason for anyone to think of them as inhabited space at all. That assumption stopped being true sometime in the years after the system was built, though nobody marked an exact date. Outreach workers and researchers who have studied the population living in the tunnels estimate the number at somewhere between roughly 500 and 1,500 people at any given time. Depending on the year and the source, a range that itself tells you something about how difficult this population is to count with any precision. What is not in dispute is that people have built an actual, if desperate, kind of home down here. Plywood platforms, salvaged furniture, tents pitched on raised ground away from the main channel floor. Journalist Matthew O'Brien first documented this world in detail in his 2007 book, Beneath the Neon, spending years building trust with people living underground before writing about what he found, treating his subjects as people navigating an extraordinarily difficult situation rather than a spectacle. He later returned to the subject with a follow-up book in 2020, tracking how the population and the conditions had changed over more than a decade. Since then, a nonprofit called Shine a Light Foundation, founded in 2015, has conducted ongoing outreach, bringing supplies, medical referrals, and a standing offer of help to people who mostly are not ready to accept it yet, understanding that trust in this kind of outreach work is built slowly, over repeated visits, rather than through a single conversation. Robert Banghart, the foundation's outreach director, has described the tunnel population as something that grows and shrinks with the city's own economic pressures rather than staying fixed, rising when housing costs climb, dipping temporarily when major events like a new stadium opening or a championship game draw extra law enforcement attention to the areas around tunnel entrances. Here is the implication worth pausing on, because it is easy to look past. Extreme heat above ground, summer temperatures in Las Vegas regularly exceeding 120 degrees in recent years, combined with a housing market where market rents climbed by roughly 20% in a single year, according to Clark County's own reporting, has pushed a genuine, permanent population into a space nobody designed for human habitation. This is not a story about criminals hiding from the law, though some certainly are. It is mostly a story about ordinary economic and personal pressure finding the only available shelter left, underground, out of sight, beneath a city that spends enormous effort, money, and lighting design making sure its visible surface looks nothing like this, a city built almost entirely around the idea of spectacle above ground, while something considerably harder to look at continues quietly beneath it. It is worth being careful here about how this chapter is framed, because the story does not need exaggeration to be affecting. Life in the tunnels is shaped by real, documented danger, not narrative flourish. During monsoon season, roughly late June through September, a storm many miles away can send a sudden surge of water through a tunnel with almost no warning at street level. Since the rain that triggers a flood far upstream may never fall anywhere near the tunnel entrance itself. Outreach workers describe watching for a very specific sign: water beginning to spurt or seep from small drainage holes in the tunnel walls, a signal that a larger flow is minutes away and everyone underground needs to leave immediately, gathering whatever belongings can be carried and moving fast toward the nearest exit grate. Documented deaths from flash flooding in the tunnels have occurred in multiple recent years, including drownings reported by county officials after major storm events, alongside the ordinary risks of extreme heat, extreme cold at night, and the lack of any medical care readily available underground for injuries, infections, or overdoses. The physical conditions down here reflect exactly what you would expect from a space built for water, not people. Concrete walls, a constant faint echo that carries footsteps and voices further than either would travel above ground. Air that stays cooler than the surface in summer and colder than the surface in winter, punctuated by storm grates overhead that let in slivers of daylight and, at night, the muffled glow of the strip's own lighting bleeding down through the metal bars. Some sections have been personalized in small, human ways: a mattress arranged carefully in a dry corner, a shelf built from salvaged wood, decorations meant to make an unlikely space feel a little more like a home rather than a hiding place. An ordinary human instinct toward comfort and order persisting even in circumstances that would seem to make comfort and order impossible. What can be said with confidence is that this population exists, that it has existed for well over a decade in something like its current form, and that it continues to grow as regional housing costs rise faster than wages in much of the surrounding valley. What is genuinely harder to pin down, and worth being honest about, is the exact size of that population at any given moment, since estimates from different outreach organizations, journalists, and county officials have ranged from as few as 500 to as many as 1,500, reflecting both the difficulty of counting an intentionally hidden population that moves between sections of a 600-mile system and the fact that the number itself is not fixed, shifting with weather, policy, and the economic pressures of the city above. There have also been recent concrete changes to this underground world that are worth noting rather than glossing over. A multi-million-dollar flood channel upgrade project undertaken by Clark County in the mid-2020s has displaced some of the tunnel population as crews clear and reinforce specific channels, adding fencing intended to make re-entry more difficult once the work is complete. Nearby residents, for their part, have voiced real frustration about displaced individuals resettling in above-ground neighborhoods near tunnel entrances, describing break-ins, public disturbances, and a sense that each cleanup effort simply relocates the same underlying problem to a different block rather than resolving it. A reminder, in other words, that this is not a story with a clean resolution on either side. Moving people out of a dangerous tunnel does not automatically solve the underlying housing and economic pressure that put them there in the first place, and the people displaced from one section of the flood system tend, by outreach workers' own accounts, to simply relocate to another section a short distance away. This chapter sits differently in the investigation than anything that came before it. Seattle's underground is a sealed piece of the 19th century. Cincinnati's is an abandoned engineering project. Portland's is a debated historical claim. What is beneath the Las Vegas Strip is none of those things. It is not waiting to be excavated, dated, or debated by historians a century from now. It is an active, ongoing situation, shaped by decisions being made this year, this month, by county officials, nonprofit outreach workers, and the people living underground themselves, each trying to navigate a genuinely difficult set of circumstances without an easy answer available to any of them. And without a tidy ending anyone can offer with real confidence. If there is a single image that captures the strangeness of this chapter, it is the sound of a casino's rooftop air conditioning system humming faintly through a storm grate, audible to someone lying on a plywood platform a few hundred feet below the surface. Close enough to hear the machinery that keeps the world directly overhead comfortable, while the world underground manages with whatever shelter concrete and darkness can provide. Millions of tourists walk the Strip every year without any idea this world exists beneath their feet, and the people living down there are, for the most part, not hiding from tourists at all. They are simply living somewhere tourists never think to look, in a system built for water that has quietly become, for hundreds of people at any given time, the closest thing to shelter the city has left them. Las Vegas proves that the strangest hidden city in this investigation is not necessarily the oldest one. Some of what America has hidden underground did not happen a century ago and does not need historians to explain it. It is happening now, and it will still be happening tomorrow, regardless of what anyone watching this story decides to do with that information. From here, the investigation turns back toward engineered, deliberate underground spaces. Starting with a city that built an entire second downtown beneath its own streets, not for shelter from hardship, but for shelter from its own climate, a very different kind of underground world built by choice rather than by necessity. At noon on a summer weekday, downtown Houston's sidewalks can look almost abandoned. A handful of pedestrians moving quickly between shadows while the heat presses down on empty crosswalks and shimmers faintly off the pavement. It looks like a city with no workers in it. It is not. 20 feet below those same sidewalks, an entire second downtown is moving, climate-controlled, brightly lit, and on an ordinary weekday. Considerably busier than the streets sitting directly above it. This is the Houston Tunnel System, roughly 6 miles of connected underground passageways linking 95 city blocks, and the strangest thing about it is not that it exists. Plenty of American cities have built something similar: Chicago, Dallas, Minneapolis, Montreal, Toronto, each solving its own version of the same basic problem, moving people comfortably through a downtown without forcing them outside. What makes Houston's version worth a chapter of its own is how it came to exist, not through a single unified plan, but through decades of individual building owners quietly deciding, one connection at a time, that their tenants deserved a way to avoid the Texas sun. Here is the old assumption worth stating before it gets complicated. A city's foot traffic belongs on its streets. If a downtown looks empty at lunchtime, that generally means the workers who normally fill it have gone home early, or the city itself has emptied out economically, the way struggling downtowns across the country sometimes do. That assumption breaks down completely in Houston, and the reason has nothing to do with economic decline. The earliest known tunnel connection dates to the 1930s, when oilman and former Texas Governor Ross Sterling linked two buildings he owned, reportedly inspired by an underground concourse he had seen at Rockefeller Center in New York, and deciding Houston's own downtown deserved something similar, on a far smaller scale, purely for the practical benefit of his own tenants. Around the same period, a theater and radio station owner named Will Horwitz separately connected 3 of his movie theaters by tunnel, a move driven by simple economics. Sharing a single air conditioning system across multiple buildings was considerably cheaper than cooling each one independently, in a city where reliable air conditioning was still a genuine luxury. Available to relatively few buildings at all in the 1930s, neither of those 2 projects had anything to do with each other, and neither was part of any larger municipal plan. That is the detail worth sitting with. Houston's tunnel system did not begin as infrastructure in the way a subway or a sewer system is infrastructure. Planned centrally and built according to a single blueprint approved by a city government. It began as 2 unrelated private business decisions made roughly a decade apart by 2 men solving entirely separate problems: an oilman looking to move comfortably between his own properties and a theater owner looking to cut his cooling bill, who happened to land on the same underground solution without ever coordinating with each other at all. The idea of connecting tunnels into something resembling a shared system is usually traced to 1961, when the Bank of the Southwest building was linked by tunnel to a nearby parking garage and to the Melly Esperson building, according to architectural historian Stephen Fox. Even then, this was not a public works project. It was one more private agreement between adjacent property owners, each deciding that a tunnel connection benefited their own tenants enough to justify the construction cost, without any expectation that the connection would eventually become part of something citywide. The pattern repeated itself for decades afterward, particularly during Houston's major downtown building boom in the 1970s and 1980s, as new office towers, hotels, and parking structures were built with the explicit expectation that they would eventually tie into the growing underground network next door, developers treating a future tunnel connection almost like a standard utility hookup, something a serious downtown building would was simply expected to include from the start. Here is the contradiction that makes Houston's tunnel system stranger than it first appears. No single authority owns, operates, or even fully maps this system today. It is not run the way a subway or a public transit network is run, with unified hours, centralized maintenance, and one agency responsible for the whole. Each segment belongs to whichever building or group of buildings it connects, and access, hours, and even whether a given passage stays open on a particular day depend entirely on decisions made by individual property owners rather than any city government. A downtown Houston worker relying on the tunnel system to get to lunch is, in a very real sense, relying on the goodwill and business hours of dozens of separate private entities, all of whom happen to have agreed, informally, over the better part of a century, to keep their doors connected, with no contract or ordinance obligating any of them to keep it that way indefinitely. That has real, practical consequences. The tunnel system has been criticized for its numerous stairways, particularly in older sections, which make wheelchair access difficult or impossible in some stretches, since retrofitting a decades-old private tunnel segment for accessibility is a cost each individual building owner has to justify on its own, without any centralized funding source pushing for a unified standard the way a public transit agency might be required to meet. Downtown Houston's own tunnel district director has acknowledged as much publicly, noting that adding ramps in some of the older sections would be difficult or impossible without sacrificing the headroom pedestrians need to pass through comfortably. There is no single map that fully and reliably captures every connection, because the system itself has never stopped quietly growing, shrinking, and rerouting as individual buildings are renovated, sold, or demolished. Most recently, when the Houston Chronicle's old downtown complex, once connected to the tunnel system, was demolished in 2017 after the paper's operations relocated elsewhere in the city. Today, an estimated 200,000 people move through the tunnel system on a typical workday, moving between office towers, hotels, restaurants, and parking garages without ever stepping into the Houston heat, some spending an entire 8-hour shift downtown without setting foot on an actual street. The tunnels hold their own small underground economy. Dry cleaners, newsstands, barbershops, food courts, gift shops selling souvenirs to the office workers who pass by them daily. Effectively, a second commercial district running in parallel beneath the visible one, except that this one keeps a constant 72 degrees, regardless of what the thermometer reads on the sidewalk directly above it. Guided tours now exist specifically to walk curious visitors through the system's Art Deco architectural details and public art installations, treating a stretch of privately owned service corridors as a genuine local attraction in its own right. But the same feature that makes the tunnel system valuable, its position 20 feet below street level, also makes it vulnerable in a way no purely surface-level shopping district could be. In June 2001, Tropical Storm Allison stalled directly over Houston for days, dropping record rainfall across the region, far more than the city's drainage infrastructure was ever designed to handle in so short a period. Floodwater from the overflowing Buffalo Bayou found its way into the tunnel system, and once inside, it did something the tunnel's original builders almost certainly never anticipated when they cut those first passages back in the 1930s. Water moved between connected buildings through the tunnel network itself, flooding basements, electrical rooms, and mechanical equipment in structures that had experienced no flooding whatsoever at street level, simply because their basement happened to connect, underground, to a building elsewhere downtown that had already taken on water. The very feature that let workers avoid the summer heat also let a flood spread between buildings as if the tunnel system were a single connected bathtub, water finding the path of least resistance through corridors that had never been designed with that kind of failure in mind. That is the twist worth sitting with. Houston built an entire second downtown specifically to escape its own climate. Heat, humidity, sudden downpours, and then discovered, during one of the worst storms in the city's history, that the same underground connections built for comfort had quietly created a new pathway for exactly the kind of disaster they were meant to help people avoid. Total damage across the Houston region from that single storm reached an estimated $5 billion, with particularly heavy losses in the city's medical center complex, where floodwater entering underground parking garages and connected tunnels caused damage estimated at well over $1 billion on its own. Some of the worst losses occurred in facilities whose only real vulnerability was a tunnel connection to somewhere else that had flooded first. A chain reaction moving building to building underground long after the surface floodwaters themselves had already begun to recede. In the aftermath, several buildings installed floodgates specifically at their tunnel entrances, treating the underground connections the way a ship treats a bulkhead, a point that could be sealed off entirely if water started coming through. An engineering fix retrofitted onto a system nobody had originally built with flooding in mind at all. There is something worth noticing in how differently this chapter's underground world behaves compared to almost everything else in this investigation. Seattle's underground was sealed by accident and later reopened for tourism. Cincinnati's was built with a plan and then abandoned entirely. Houston's has never stopped being used for a single day since its earliest tunnels opened in the 1930s, and it continues to grow and change today, entirely without anyone in charge of the whole. It is less a single structure than a decades-long ongoing negotiation between dozens of separate property owners, each deciding again and again that staying connected underground is worth more than staying separate, a pattern of quiet cooperation with no formal name and no single founding document. You could spend an entire lunch break down here and never once feel the Texas heat. Gliding past a coffee shop, a dry cleaner, a stretch of public art tucked into an unused corner, and never once think about the fact that no single person or agency actually oversees the tunnel you are walking through. Houston solved its climate problem by quietly building an entire invisible city, block by block, decade by decade, and then never bothering to formally finish the job with a name, a map, or an owner, leaving it instead as a patchwork that somehow, against the odds, keeps working anyway. Houston's tunnels move people, quietly and efficiently, one building's private decision at a time. But not every American underground space was carved out to shelter workers from bad weather. Some were carved out for a very different reason entirely. Extracting something directly from the earth itself, on a timescale that makes even Houston's 90-year-old tunnel network look almost recent by comparison, reaching down not into the 20th century, but into a version of the planet that existed hundreds of millions of years before anyone thought to dig a tunnel at all. A cage elevator drops through darkness for what feels like a long time. Cables singing faintly overhead, and when the doors finally open, the beam of a headlamp lands on a road. Not a tunnel wall, not a mine shaft, an actual road, wide enough for a pickup truck, stretching off into the dark in both directions, its surface gleaming faintly white and gray. This is more than 1,000 feet beneath Detroit, Michigan, and the road is made entirely of salt. Here is the assumption worth naming before this chapter goes any further. Whatever sits underground beneath an American city was, by definition, put there by people, sometime within the span of that city's own recorded history. A basement, a tunnel, a subway, a mine shaft, all of it dug out and shaped by human hands within the last century or two, following a human timeline from start to finish. That assumption collapses completely at the bottom of this particular elevator shaft. The salt filling this mine did not arrive with Detroit's founders, its railroads, or its automobile factories. It formed roughly 400 million years ago, during a period long before anything resembling a mammal walked the earth. When a shallow inland sea repeatedly flooded a low basin covering much of what is now Michigan, evaporated under an ancient sun, and left thick beds of salt behind each time, layer stacking on layer over an almost unimaginable stretch of time, the water arriving and retreating again and again as sea levels rose and fell over spans of time too long for a human mind to hold comfortably. The basin itself sat in an arid stretch of what would eventually become Michigan's lower peninsula, cut off from the wider ocean by a natural land barrier, so that each time water pushed back in, it had nowhere to go but slowly evaporate in place, concentrating its minerals until salt alone remained on the basin floor. Glaciers later pushed sediment over the top of those beds, burying the salt under more than 1,000 feet of rock and soil, sealing it away until people eventually found a reason to go looking for it, digging down through millions of years of accumulated earth to reach something the planet had finished making long before it had any use for a Detroit at all. That reason arrived in 1895, when the existence of a large rock salt deposit beneath Detroit was officially confirmed. Here is where the human part of this story turns considerably harder than the geology. Reaching that salt meant sinking a shaft through more than 1,000 feet of stone and glacial debris, a genuinely dangerous undertaking with the mining technology available at the turn of the century, requiring workers to blast, drill, and haul their way downward through rock that had no interest in giving up its depths easily. The first company to attempt it, the Detroit Salt and Manufacturing Company, went bankrupt in the process, and 6 workers died during the shaft's construction, killed by conditions modern mine safety standards would never permit today. A human cost easy to lose sight of once the finished mine starts sounding like an engineering curiosity rather than a place where people actually risked and lost their lives. It took a full reorganization of the company under new ownership to finally complete a shaft roughly 1,060 feet deep in 1910, more than a decade after the salt had first been confirmed to exist, and more than a decade of failed attempts, financial collapse, and death standing between the initial discovery and the moment anyone actually profited from it. A second, deeper shaft followed in the 1920s, built specifically to speed up the process of hoisting salt to the surface and to bring larger equipment down into the mine, a response to the first shaft's limited capacity as production demands grew year over year. Because the shaft openings themselves were relatively narrow, heavy machinery had to be disassembled entirely at the surface, lowered piece by piece into the darkness, and reassembled by hand in an underground machine shop before it could be put to use. A detail that gives some sense of just how difficult it was to build any kind of real operation this far beneath a city, workers essentially building their own factory in the dark, one carefully lowered component at a time, before a single ton of salt could be pulled up to the surface. Once inside, miners used a method called room and pillar extraction, the same basic technique that carved out Kansas City's subtropolis half a continent away, cutting large rectangular chambers out of the salt bed while leaving roughly half the material behind in the form of thick, load-bearing pillars. The difference here being that the pillars themselves are made of solid salt rather than limestone, glowing faintly white under artificial light rather than the gray of quarried stone. Over more than a century of continuous and interrupted operation, that process has produced over 100 miles of roadway and more than 1,500 acres of underground space, laid out in a grid regular enough that workers navigate it much the way they would navigate an actual city, following named routes rather than simply wandering through undifferentiated tunnel, complete with intersections, traffic patterns, and the kind of practical wayfinding any driver above ground would recognize immediately. Here is the detail worth sitting with before moving further. Every one of those roads, every pillar, every wall glowing faintly white under a flashlight beam is made of something that existed on this planet long before complex land animals did, long before there was a Michigan, a United States, or a species capable of digging a mine shaft at all. Workers riding an elevator down to their shift each morning are, in the most literal sense, driving to work inside the fossilized remains of an ocean that dried up hundreds of millions of years before human beings existed to notice it was gone, clocking in for an ordinary industrial job inside a structure that predates almost every other measurement of time this investigation has used so far, dwarfing even the geological age of the limestone that made Subtropolis and Louisville's mega Cavern possible. The mine has not run continuously since 1910. International Salt Company, which had purchased the operation by 1914 and pushed production to roughly 8,000 tons a month within a few years, mostly serving the leather tanning and food processing industries that relied on rock salt as a raw material long before it became better known for melting winter ice. Eventually closed the mine in 1983 as demand shifted and market conditions changed. For a stretch of the mid-1980s, the empty mine sat under consideration as a potential site for hazardous waste storage, a proposal that generated real local debate about whether a structure this deep and this stable might safely contain materials too dangerous to store anywhere near the surface. That plan ultimately went nowhere, leaving the ancient salt beds simply idle underground for over a decade, a 1,000-foot deep space, complete with its own roads and machine shops, sitting in the dark with no clear purpose, while owners changed hands and city officials debated what, if anything, should be done with it. Production resumed in 1998 under new ownership, and the mine was acquired by the Kistner Group, a Canadian company, in 2010. Today it remains Michigan's only operating rock salt mine, still supplying a significant share of the road de-icing salt spread across the region every winter, employing a modern workforce whose commute begins each morning with a ride down the very shaft their predecessors died building over a century earlier. That last detail deserves a moment on its own because it connects the deep, almost incomprehensible timescale of this chapter to something completely ordinary, the kind of thing most people drive over without a second thought every winter. A Michigan snowplow spreading salt on an icy road on any given winter night may well be scattering material that has sat undisturbed since before there were oceans arranged anything like the ones we know today, since before dinosaurs, since before most of the animal kingdom as it now exists had evolved at all. Something 400 million years old, mined from 1,000 feet beneath a modern American city by workers riding an elevator down each morning, ends its journey melting ice under the tires of a passing car within a matter of weeks, and almost nobody driving over it. Late for work, wipers struggling against the sleet. Gives that fact a second thought. There is no real scholarly controversy attached to this chapter, no debated interpretation the way Portland's tunnels demand one, and no ongoing human crisis the way Las Vegas's storm drains do. What Detroit's salt mine offers instead is a different kind of strangeness entirely. Not a mystery about what happened, but a genuine, almost dizzying sense of scale. Every other underground space in this investigation involves a human timeline, decades, sometimes a century or two at most. This one reaches back far enough that human history barely registers as a fraction of it, a sliver at the very end of an unimaginably long geological story that was already ancient before Detroit, before cars, before the United States, before anything resembling recorded history existed anywhere on Earth at all. You could stand at the bottom of that elevator shaft and press a flashlight beam directly against the nearest wall, and rather than reflecting back the way it would off a painted surface, the light seems to vanish into the salt itself, swallowed by a material dense and pure enough that geologists studying samples from the mine describe it as remarkably clean, nearly free of the impurities that mark lower-grade deposits found elsewhere in the world. That purity is itself a kind of evidence, a record of exactly how still and undisturbed that ancient sea basin sat for millions of years while its water slowly evaporated away, layer after layer, with almost nothing to interrupt the process. No storms churning up sediment, no rivers introducing foreign minerals, just a patient, repeated cycle of flooding and evaporation playing out below what would eventually, unimaginably far in the future, become the streets of an American city. Detroit hollowed out ancient geology for profit, turning something the planet spent hundreds of millions of years quietly building into road salt and, before that, into leather tanning and food preservation supplies for an early 20th century industrial city that needed both badly. But not every American mine left behind for dead ends and continued industry. Some get an entirely different second act, transformed not into a working salt operation, but into a peculiar mixture of business park, Cold War contingency plan, and modern-day playground. Hollowed out of limestone rather than salt, in a city known more for bourbon and horse racing than for anything happening beneath its streets, where a hillside blasted apart for cheap building stone came, at one especially tense point in the 20th century, within a crisis of becoming a refuge for tens of thousands of frightened people. A zipline rider steps off a platform and drops into total darkness 100 feet beneath the Waterson Expressway, cables humming overhead as they carry across a cavern large enough to swallow a small mountain hole, the beam of a helmet light catching only fragments of a ceiling that seems to disappear entirely into the black above. Somewhere far above, cars are moving along 10 lanes of interstate traffic, drivers with no idea that the ground beneath their tires is, in a very real and very literal sense, hollow. This is the Louisville Mega Cavern, and it holds the distinction, official and legally recognized, of being the largest building in the entire state of Kentucky. Despite the fact that most of it was never built at all, it was blasted out. Here is the assumption worth naming before this chapter unfolds. An old, exhausted quarry, stripped of everything valuable it once contained, has exactly one likely future. It sits abandoned, slowly reclaimed by weeds and rainwater, or it gets sealed off entirely as a hazard. The way so many worked-out mines across the country eventually are. That is not what happened here, and the specific detour this particular quarry story took is stranger than almost anything else in this investigation, involving not one, but several unrelated second acts stacked on top of each other across nearly a century, each one leaving the space a little more layered than the one before it. The space began its working life in the 1930s as Louisville crushed stone, a limestone quarry that operated for roughly 42 years. Miners systematically cutting rock out of the hillside to supply construction material for roads and buildings across the region, feeding a construction boom that reshaped much of the surrounding Midwest with material pulled directly from this one, Kentucky. Hillside. By 1972, the deposit had been worked out, and the quarry sat empty, 100 acres of man-made cave beneath Louisville's Watterson Expressway, and notably, beneath the Louisville Zoo as well, its usefulness apparently finished. One more scar in the landscape left behind once a resource stops being profitable to extract. For roughly 17 years, that emptiness simply sat there, one more worked out mine among many in a part of the country full of them. 100 acres of quiet, unlit stone with no obvious next chapter. Then, in 1989, a group of private investors, led by a businessman named Jim Lowry, purchased the site with the explicit intention of turning it into what they called a high-security business park. The pitch was familiar by now to anyone who has followed this investigation through Kansas City and Detroit: stable temperature, structural protection from weather, and an enormous amount of space available at a fraction of the cost of building anything comparable above ground. Workers raised the floor level throughout large sections of the cavern using recycled concrete, brick, and other construction debris, turning an uneven quarry floor into something level and usable, and the space began attracting tenants for storage, light industry, and eventually a recycling operation that continues to operate there today, quietly processing materials in the same rock chambers where limestone was once blasted free of the hillside. Here is where the story takes its strangest turn, the one that separates this chapter from a simple repeat of the Kansas City pattern. During the Cold War, well before the current commercial redevelopment began, the space, then still an active limestone mine, was reportedly designated as a fallout shelter, part of the broader civil defense planning that treated stable, deep underground spaces as genuine assets in the event of nuclear war, a period when American cities across the country were quietly identifying basements, tunnels, and mines that might shelter civilians if the Cold War ever turned hot. According to site operators and local reporting, a list of roughly 50,000 names existed, people who would be granted entry into this specific cavern if the unthinkable ever happened, an emergency population large enough to fill a mid-sized American city, all planned around one hollowed-out Kentucky hillside that, at the time, was still actively being mined for construction stone during the day, while quietly serving as a contingency plan against annihilation. It is worth being careful with this detail, because it deserves the same evidentiary caution as anything else in this investigation. The 50,000 name shelter list comes from site operators and local reporting rather than a fully declassified, independently verified federal document, and it should be treated as a well-attested local claim rather than an absolutely confirmed official record with a paper trail anyone can inspect directly. What can be said with more confidence is that Cold War-era civil defense planning genuinely did designate large, stable underground spaces like this one for exactly this kind of purpose across the country, cataloging available shelter capacity in cities nationwide, and that a plan involving a cavern this size, this deep, and this structurally sound fits comfortably within what is independently known about how that broader planning effort actually worked. Think about what that means for a moment. The same rock walls that made this space commercially useless for almost anything except quarrying, too remote, too awkward in shape for most conventional development. 100 acres of raw excavated stone with no obvious second purpose once the mining stopped turned out to be exactly the qualities that made it one of the most secure, storm-proof, temperature-stable structures in the entire state. A quality that seemed like a limitation from a construction standpoint became, from a survival standpoint, the single most valuable feature the space had to offer, transforming an ordinary industrial liability into an asset nobody involved in the original quarrying operation could have anticipated. That same durability explains the second life the cavern has found today, considerably less grim than a nuclear shelter, but built on precisely the same physical foundation. The mega cavern maintains a nearly constant temperature, somewhere in the high 50s year-round, cool enough in summer and mild enough in winter that it functions as an all-weather attraction, regardless of what conditions are doing on the surface directly overhead, immune to rain, snow, heat waves, or anything else the Kentucky sky might produce on a given day. Visitors today can take a narrated tram tour through sections of the cavern explaining its geological and mining history, walk an aerial ropes course, suspended entirely underground, the only fully underground course of its kind anywhere in the country, and one of roughly 20 of its type in the entire United States, or ride zip lines across cavern rooms so large that a beam of headlamp light barely reaches the far wall, cables strung between platforms that let visitors soar both 100 feet below the surface and within the cavern itself, close to 100 feet above its own floor. Each winter, the cavern hosts an elaborate drive through holiday light display, billed as the largest underground display of its kind anywhere in the world. Cars winding through illuminated tunnels that spent most of the 20th century as an active quarry blasting rock for road construction. Families driving past twinkling lights in a space where, a few decades earlier, blasting crews would have been clearing debris after a controlled explosion. For a period, the cavern also housed the world's largest fully indoor mountain bike park. 45 trails spread across more than 300,000 square feet of former mine floor, riders navigating jump lines and technical single track entirely by artificial light, in a space where weather, by definition, could never interfere with a ride, dressed for summer in the middle of a Kentucky winter storm happening completely out of sight overhead. That particular attraction has since closed permanently, though operators have suggested the space could see biking return in some form in the future. One more example of how thoroughly adaptable this particular hollowed-out hillside has proven to be across nearly a century of continuously changing use, shifting from quarry to shelter to storage to recreation without ever once needing to be dug any deeper than the original miners left it. Here is what makes this chapter a fitting late turn in the larger investigation. Every underground space covered so far has had, at most, one or two distinct identities across its history. A buried street, an abandoned subway, a repurposed limestone mine turned business complex. Louisville's cavern has had considerably more than that, layering purpose on top of purpose within a single physical footprint. It began as an active quarry, supplying literal building material to a growing region. It became, according to well-documented local history, a designated refuge from potential nuclear catastrophe, a plan serious enough to involve tens of thousands of names on a list. Quietly maintained during the same years, the quarry above, it kept producing crushed stone for ordinary roads and driveways. It became a business park and recycling facility once the stone ran out, and eventually it became a genuine tourist attraction, offering some of the most unusual recreational experiences available anywhere in the country. Precisely because the same physical properties that made it valuable for civil defense, its depth, its stability, its total isolation from surface weather, also make it an unusually safe and controlled environment for zip lines and bike trails aimed at families looking for an afternoon of entertainment rather than shelter from catastrophe. You feel the drop before you fully register it, 100 feet of open air and stone rushing past in the dark, and it is difficult, in that instant, not to try to picture the same tunnel packed instead with tens of thousands of frightened families, rather than thrill seekers paying for an adrenaline rush, two entirely different uses for the exact same physical space, separated by little more than which decade happened to need it most. A hole blasted out of a Kentucky hillside for cheap building stone came, at one particularly tense point in the 20th century, within a genuine crisis, away from becoming a literal underground refuge for a population the size of a small American city, a fate its original quarry workers. Hauling limestone out block by block in the 1930s, with no idea what the space above and around their work would eventually become, could never have imagined for the tunnels they were leaving behind. From an ancient sea beneath Detroit to a Cold War shelter beneath Louisville, this investigation has moved from geology to fear to recreation. Each underground space revealing something a little stranger and a little more layered than the one before it. It is time now to return to where the story started, to a city that did not dig underground on purpose at all and had to decide decades later whether it was finally ready to dig its own buried history back up into the light, and to ask what that first buried street looks like now that we understand everything else that has been hiding beneath American cities the whole time. A visitor steps onto a descending escalator in downtown Atlanta and rides down into what looks, at first glance, like an ordinary basement shopping arcade. Then the details start to register. Brick storefronts with proportions that belong to another century. A cast iron column holding up a ceiling far too old to have been built for this. A gas lamp, its glass globe scarred by something that turns out, on closer inspection, to be a cannonball mark from the Civil War. You are not looking at a recreation. This is Lower Alabama Street, and it is not a set built to look historic. It is the real thing, sealed beneath a modern viaduct for the better part of a century, cobblestones and all. To understand how a city's own original downtown ended up beneath itself, it helps to go back to what made Atlanta exist in the first place. The city grew up around converging railroad lines, so directly that its original name, Terminus, described exactly what it was. The endpoint of several rail routes meeting in one place in the middle of Georgia. By the early 20th century, that same railroad geography, once the reason for the city's existence, had become its biggest problem. Multiple lines crossed the heart of downtown at street level, and the resulting tangle of trains, streetcars, wagons, and pedestrians all fighting for the same intersections created a level of gridlock and danger that business leaders openly complained about for years, describing it, in the language of the time, as a bottleneck strangling the city's own growth, one that only worsened as Atlanta's population and automobile traffic both kept climbing through the 1910s and 1920s. Here is the old assumption worth stating plainly before the story breaks it. A city solves a traffic problem at street level by adding lanes, rerouting streets, building a bridge here or there, keeping everything essentially on the same plane it has always occupied. Atlanta's solution was considerably stranger than that. Beginning around 1927 and finishing in 1929, the city built what became known as the Twin Viaducts, a set of elevated concrete roadways carrying Pryor Street, Central Avenue, Alabama Street, and Wall Street a full story or more above the tangle of railroad tracks below. It was, in effect, an entire new ground level constructed directly on top of the old one, engineered to separate car and pedestrian traffic from the trains permanently. A solution that required rethinking essentially the entire footprint of downtown rather than simply widening a single problematic intersection. The project meant excavating and repaving sections of street, building substantial retaining walls, and rerouting utility lines, sewers, gas mains, electrical cabling, all before the new elevated roadway could even be poured. A multi-year undertaking that touched nearly every block in the affected district before it was finished. Here is the contradiction that makes this final chapter such a fitting place to end. Business owners along the affected streets did not close up shop and rebuild from scratch the way they arguably could have. Instead, they adapted in place. In a move that echoes almost exactly what happened in Seattle nearly 4 decades earlier and 3,000 miles away. Merchants simply moved their storefronts up to the new viaduct level, converting what had been their ground floors. The very same brick facades, cast iron storefronts, granite steps, and gas lamps that had served customers since the years right after the Civil War, into basements. The buildings themselves stayed exactly where they were, only the definition of which floor counted as street level changed. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the same move that created Seattle's underground, arrived at completely independently, on the other side of the country, for an entirely different reason. Seattle raised its streets to escape flooding after a fire. Atlanta raised its streets to escape its own railroad tracks. Neither city set out to bury a piece of its own downtown. Both ended up doing exactly that, almost as an afterthought to solving a completely different problem. For roughly the next 40 years, this sealed original street level sat mostly forgotten. Its cobblestones going quiet, its gas lamps going dark, a version of Atlanta preserved by accident directly beneath the version everyone actually used. It did not stay entirely empty. During Prohibition, some of the enclosed spaces beneath the viaducts became speakeasies, taking advantage of exactly the kind of low visibility. Out-of-the-way space that a sealed 19th century basement provides, patrons descending into what had once been an ordinary storefront to drink somewhere the law was unlikely to look. The rediscovery, when it finally came, followed a familiar pattern from earlier in this investigation, echoing Bill Speidel's work in Seattle decades before. In the 1960s, two Georgia Tech graduates recognized the commercial and historical potential sitting untouched beneath the modern viaducts, brickwork, granite archways, cast iron pilasters, and gas street lamps that had survived essentially intact simply because nobody had bothered to tear them out during 4 decades of near-total neglect. They began acquiring leases on the buildings beneath Central Avenue, Pryor, Alabama, and Wall Street, and in 1969, the space reopened to the public as Underground Atlanta, a nightlife and retail district built entirely around the novelty of walking through 19th century Atlanta while modern traffic rumbled along invisibly overhead. Tourists and locals alike drawn by the strange thrill of stepping into a genuinely old American streetscape without leaving downtown at all. The reopening was, for a time, a genuine sensation, drawing millions of visitors during its early years and briefly making Underground Atlanta one of the most talked about attractions in the American South, a place where visitors could drink, shop, and hear live music surrounded by gas lamps and 19th century brick without ever suspecting the ordinary modern traffic passing directly overhead. That success did not last uninterrupted. In the mid-1970s, construction of Atlanta's new rapid transit system, MARTA, required demolishing roughly a third of Underground Atlanta's original footprint to make way for rail lines, cutting directly through a space that had only recently been reclaimed from decades of neglect, undoing years of restoration work in the name of yet another infrastructure project layered on top of everything that had come before it. The district has cycled through periods of decline and reinvestment repeatedly in the decades since, closing sections, reopening others, changing ownership and vision more than once, and as of the mid-2020s, it remains under active redevelopment. Its long-term future, still, in a very real sense, unresolved. That unresolved quality matters, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Unlike some of the tidier stories in this investigation, Underground Atlanta has never settled into a single permanent identity. It has been a forgotten basement, a Prohibition hideout, a triumphant 1960s rediscovery, a construction casualty, and a district perpetually being redeveloped into whatever comes next. There is no clean ending here, only an ongoing negotiation between a city's past and whatever its present decides that past is worth. One detail beneath the viaducts deserves special attention before this investigation closes: a small stone marker, easy to walk past without a second glance. The 0-mile post, the original marker establishing the exact point around which Atlanta was founded in 1837 as a railroad terminus, still sits under a viaduct today, largely unnoticed by the office workers and MARTA riders passing directly overhead. The literal birthplace of the city, the fixed point everything else in Atlanta was eventually measured from, has spent the better part of a century underground rather than on top of it, buried beneath the very transportation infrastructure it originally existed to serve. That brings this investigation back, finally, to where it began. A tour guide's flashlight, 10 American cities ago, crossed a rusted teller's cage and a rotted sign reading Northern Hotel. One story beneath a Seattle sidewalk that ordinary tourists cross every day without a second thought. Atlanta's 0-mile post sits in almost exactly the same relationship to the city above it, a founding point, quietly buried, still there, still real, still waiting beneath a viaduct built to solve a completely unrelated problem nearly a century ago. 10 places, 10 different reasons for going underground. A fire and a flooding problem in Seattle. Abandoned transit ambition in Cincinnati. A curve too elegant for its own system's growth in Manhattan. A limestone mine turned into an entire commercial economy in Kansas City. A legend that outgrew its own evidence in Portland. A hidden, present tense population living beneath the brightest lights in the country in Las Vegas. A private, unplanned second downtown built purely to escape the heat in Houston. 400 million years of ancient ocean turned into winter road salt in Detroit. A quarry that nearly became a Cold War refuge before becoming a playground in Louisville. And now, an entire original downtown, railroad tracks, gas lamps, cast iron, and all, buried beneath its own replacement in Atlanta, its own 0-mile post, still marking a birthplace that almost no one walking overhead remembers is there. None of these places required an invented conspiracy to feel strange. None of them needed a secret society, a suppressed discovery, or a hidden agenda to explain why an American city ended up with something buried beneath its own streets. Fires happen. Floods happen. Transit projects run out of money. Mines get worked out. Housing gets too expensive. Climates get too hot. Every single hidden layer in this investigation grew out of an ordinary, explainable decision, and it was only the accumulation of those ordinary decisions, one on top of another, across a century and a half of American cities simply trying to solve their own immediate problems that left so much of the country quietly doubled, a visible city on top and a stranger one tucked away just beneath it, waiting for someone curious enough to go looking. We know a great deal more now than we did at the start of this investigation about why these spaces exist, what they contain, and what still remains genuinely uncertain about them. But something is still being kept back. Cincinnati's tunnels remain sealed, waiting for a train that will almost certainly never come. Portland's basements still hold more legend than anyone can fully separate from fact. And beneath the brightest, most surveilled stretch of pavement in the entire country, in the storm drains under the Las Vegas Strip, an entirely hidden population is still living underground tonight. In a story with no ending yet written at all. Somewhere in Seattle, right now, a tourist is walking across a sidewalk embedded with thick colored glass, checking their phone, thinking about lunch, with no idea that a century-old storefront sits frozen in the dark just beneath their shoes. You could stand on that same glass, right now, and never know it either. Unless someone happened to tell you what was actually underneath. That is, in the end, the quiet thread connecting all 10 of these places. A fire, a flood, an abandoned subway, a beautiful curve, a limestone hillside, a legend, a storm drain, a heat wave, an ancient sea, a Cold War fear, a railroad crossing, each one waiting the way all 10 of these places are waiting. For someone to finally look down